Thanks to Intel for sponsoring the Pancake Breakfast from Tectonic Summit. The topic for the discussion, how Kubernetes plays with the open source community. Intel is a major supporter of the cloud-native ecosystem and the new dimensions of a multi-cloud world. It has recently made significant investments in Snap, an open source telemetry tool that is designed to easily collect, process, and publish telemetry data at scale. Learn more at snap-telemetry.io. That's snap-telemetry.io. Welcome to Tectonic Summit. My name is Alex Williams. I'm founder and editor-in-chief of the new Stack. And we host these pancake breakfasts at different conferences. We call it the Pancake Breakfast Circuit. We're usually here with our pancake robot, who we call Stacky, but Stacky is taking a little break. And we have some new things in store for our robot next year, but we'll save those for another time. I want to just, first of all, tell you a little bit about the new Stack. You know, our focus is on application development and management at scale. We are a media company, so to speak, but we're also somewhat of an analyst firm, I think, to some extent as well. So we do a lot of different types of work, covering the community, events like this, ebooks and the such. This Pancake Breakfast actually got its start at the original CoreOS Fest in San Francisco in 2015. And I was on the phone with Melissa Smolensky, and we were thinking about what to do. And I said, well, what if we did something like a breakfast? We could say, let's have a short stack with the new Stack. And so I want to thank CoreOS for making that really happen. And we've been doing it ever since. But one of the biggest, organizations that has really helped us do these events has been Intel, and Intel is the sponsor for the breakfast this morning. So let's give a big hand for Intel and all the work that they've been doing in the community. They're a big supporter of the ecosystem, and they came to us earlier in the year, and they said, we'd like to do an ebook. And so we said, well, let's do one on use cases for Kubernetes. And today we have our first printed copy of the book, and we're going to be making it available at the luncheon today that Intel is hosting here at the event. So for our panel discussion today, we're going to be, really just talking about. I'm just going to pull up my notes quickly. We're talking about the open source community around Kubernetes, really, and I really want to talk about it in three. There's three focuses to this conversation that I'd like to have. Number one, how is Kubernetes an open source community being managed? And number two, what is its direction? And number three, what is the context right now? Business is, software is obviously the center of business, and software is increasingly open source. And we've seen a real kind of jump in size of different communities, and Kubernetes in particular, as well as communities like Docker. So I'm looking for that context. I'm joined by Joe Jackson, our managing editor. And Joe will be taking questions from the crowd. We're going to be going about 30 minutes or so, so we really encourage you to ask a question if you have one. I'll be calling out as well to see if there's something that someone has to ask. So joining us for our breakfast discussion today is Jonathan Donaldson of Intel. Hey, Jonathan. Nishi Davidson of SAP. We have Mike Saparov of CoreOS. And Andy Randall of Tigera. And thank you guys for joining us. So, one of the things that, I'm really curious about is, how do you guys view the Kubernetes ecosystem right now? To me, it seems like we're at this defining point, right? The Kubernetes community has more than 1,000 contributors. It's grown significantly in the past year. I think, Docker has 1,500, but everyone thought that was like unprecedented. But now we're seeing you guys, the community here grow significantly. And, with that, we've seen, one of the things that we've noticed in these communities is how difficult it becomes to manage over some period of time, right? Just because it's not like a technology issue, it's more of like a people issue, right? And so I'm curious about what your perspectives are on the state of the ecosystem right now, both as users, but also as people who are, actively, involved in its direction. So, Jonathan?
Yeah, so I think probably the biggest defining moment for me right now, or I think for the Kubernetes community itself, is if you look at some of the other communities, right, that we've all been involved with, a lot of us have, OpenStack and things like that, that is a community of vendors, more so than a community of developers. I think Kubernetes right now, along with CNCF, is much more of a community of developers and operators and users than it is of vendors, and I think we're at that inflection point right now where I think that's the right path, and it should continue to take that path because you get a much more innovative ecosystem around that. And I think that's that's where we are right now, where Kubernetes is versus other things. And so I think it's up to us, right, as a vendor though, unfortunately, but it's up to us as users and as developers in that community to continue to keep that feeling.
Nishi, you know, I was talking with you beforehand, and you guys have been involved in the upstream community. What are some of your thoughts right now about the community itself and like its readiness, so to speak, for the customers out there? How because you've been actually a customer of the platform itself in many respects.
Yeah. So I think I agree with Jonathan that from an OpenStack standpoint, a lot of us were using OpenStack as a vendor and contributing back to the community. But there was a lot of dependency in terms of, how ready the plugins are from different vendors. So for example, if I wanted a NetApp plugin or EMC plugin, I really had to go test and try it out and see if the vendors have done enough work to get there. With the Kubernetes community, the beautiful thing about the open source community is if I want to build in a functionality, for example, we're working on improving the dashboard and actually contributing back to Prometheus on the monitoring side. The good part is any portion of the architecture that we want to build and improve on is easily accessible. People are already available on the community, on Stack Overflow, on Slack, in order to respond back to your messages and questions. And anything that I want to build, I can build it within 3 days or 4 days and actually ask many people for answers, which improves our ability to do a proof of concept and also shape the direction in which a product has to go. And that is extremely unique and beneficial for large companies such as SAP.
Okay. Mike, I have a question for you about the core itself. I was talking to some of the folks here earlier about, is it time to stop? Is it time to just is the core ready? What's your view on that?
I don't think it's fully ready, right? It's never ready, right? It's kind of, if you've been in software long enough, the product is never done. I think it's mature enough, definitely, to use in production environments, right? And yeah, I know there's a lot of discussion around 1.6 being stabilized in release, not implementing any new features, catching up with stability of the existing features. I'm pretty sure there'll still be some new features. My view is the product is pretty stable at this point. And if you look at the past, it's kind of amazing, right? You mentioned there are 1,000 contributors. How many enterprise companies have a 1,000 people group successfully shipping releases every quarter, right? Very, very few. And kind of community management is even more challenging than managing a group of 1,000 developers, right? And so I think it's partially kudos to the early creators of Kubernetes for defining such a kind of, it's both technical and people problem, right? I know Brandon Burns is there. So kudos to you for defining such a great architecture that it allows 1,000 developers to work in parallel so efficiently.
Andy, what do you think?
Yeah, excuse me. I think the community's done a fantastic job up to this point, and I think one of the positive signs that I'm seeing is that where companies are addressing usability issues around what might have been considered the edge of Kubernetes, and in OpenStack, those kind of things tended to get rolled up into proprietary distros of OpenStack, that those are actually getting put back into the community. So I was talking with a company recently that was looking at building some proprietary add-ons and then came to the conclusion that the community was moving so fast that they didn't have any choice other than to build it all into upstream, right? So I think that's something that we're seeing, is that people are viewing upstream as the canonical distribution, if you like. So that's been good up to this point. I do think we're at an inflection point, though, because I'm also seeing a lot of vendors who've maybe ignored Kubernetes for a while, just starting to realize that there's this train leaving the station and jumping on it. And a lot of those are kind of larger companies with a lot of politics and so I think we as a community have to be very vigilant and really kind of embrace those new contributors and those new large vendors coming in, but try and avoid the mistakes that have been made in the past on other projects.
So I would just like to get an idea of who we have here today. Raise your hand if you're a developer. Consider yourself a developer. How many people in operations would you say? Okay. Both? Who would consider themselves developer and operations? Both? That whole DevOps thing you may have heard of. The last question then I really have then is, who's using Kubernetes in production? Okay, so we have a pretty new, so the crowd out here, is there any questions that you have that you'd like to ask about the state of the ecosystem right now? Are there questions you'd like to know about where, what are its defining, what is the state of the community and the ecosystem in terms of the management overall? Or just any general question? I want to make sure that I find ways to ask questions as we, for you to ask questions as we go through this conversation. All right, we'll get Joe.
So, Kubernetes is an infrastructure ploy. How do you got a mature enterprise IT ecosystem, so to speak, and Kubernetes is challenging that. How do you test Kubernetes in an enterprise setting such that you can, how do you roll it out? Is this a big bang sort of thing, or do you start with pilot projects, or how do you start to test Kubernetes?
I can take that. So we've been working in SAP on Kubernetes for 11 months now with a single line of business. My colleague there, from Concur, they're the only guys who've actually managed to take it into production way ahead of anybody else. I can also talk about an OpenStack project in that a couple of my colleagues have built a development cluster which is running on Kubernetes and CoreOS, the Tectonic design. But essentially it runs the OpenStack components as containers, and they're building the whole development cluster based on that. But it's taken me a painful 11 months to actually move an engineering pilot into an operations pilot into a line of business, only one line of business. And I did not get any funding. And everyone kept asking, well, why don't we just build containers and put it on top of VMs? Why do we need this? What is the meaning of having another orchestration layer called Kubernetes? What does it do? And why containers? It doesn't make any sense, and I don't want to deploy something new in my infrastructure. We have trained people in VMware. They know hypervisors really well, and then along with the hypervisor infrastructure comes the storage infrastructure, which is on NAS and SCSI, and of course your VLANs and your routing policies and WAN and the way the whole data center is structured. It's highly painful, and I haven't slept in a very long time. But I think the way we structured it is the open source community helped us. Actually, I could build whatever I wanted to and prove a concept within a week's time. If anybody raised a question, that was a huge benefit for me. I didn't have to sit and struggle trying to find articles. Everything is out there, and the community helps you build whatever you need to build. That was one of the benefits the community gave us. What we did was we started with a small pilot with the line of business. We got everybody's requirements, and funny enough, the requirement is, how do I imitate or map exactly what VMware gives me today? So much so that we had to answer questions in terms of, okay, so how do we migrate containers, which is a stupid concept. You don't migrate containers, they are processes. But you had to go from base education level, prove out each and every use case, get through an engineering pilot. I also had to build a business case where I proved out the cost concept in comparison to VMware and the whole orchestration stack. I had to build out a performance business case where I showed that I was getting 10 to 12% improvement by going into the container architecture because I don't have a layer in between anymore. And now we have proved the end-to-end use case on the pilot, so people are willing to give us a chance to move into an operations pilot. But what that also meant was we had to come up with an automation that met the enterprise environment. We tried using KubeSpray, which was very difficult for us to fine-tune for an enterprise environment, so we automated everything so that we could run clusters of 50 at one go. And now we're moving into an operations pilot, and hopefully in the next 5 months we can get our production deployment, but it has been painfully slow, and without the community we wouldn't get there.
Wow, that's fascinating. Thanks to Intel for sponsoring the Pancake Breakfast from Tectonic Summit. The topic for the discussion, how Kubernetes plays with the open source community. Intel is a major supporter of the cloud-native ecosystem and the new dimensions of a multi-cloud world. It has recently made significant investments in Snap, an open source telemetry tool that is designed to easily collect, process, and publish telemetry data at scale. Learn more at snap-telemetry.io. That's snap-telemetry.io.
And get there.
Wow, that's fascinating, John.
I think it's a very common kind of journey, right? So there's a tremendous amount of education, quite a bit of tooling, right, and integration, then the pilots, and then you kind of get into the production. And that's one of the things that CNC, obviously Dan sitting over there, that we're trying to do there is really kickstart a lot of that education. I think at KubeCon, Dan had announced kind of some of the traveling roadshow type education events that they're looking to go do around that, because we think in order for enterprises to really start to take Kubernetes into production in full swing, we've got to get that momentum moving with the education side, which would have hopefully short-circuited yours by months, if not weeks, by getting the education out there. And then it's not only so much you can do for the tooling, right? That's the community that has to come up with that.
Right.
I'd add to that. Well, obviously, most enterprises are very large, complex environments, and you're not going to migrate everything at once to Kubernetes. We do see some users doing that, and I have seen, we have one customer, it's a medium-sized enterprise, and everything, they looked at all the things that they were doing. They had a bunch of AWS, they had some VMware, they had some bare metal, they had all these different environments, and they said, we want to consolidate on one. And they said, well, if we're going to consolidate on one, we might as well expand to look at what we're not currently doing, and looked and decided to move everything to Kubernetes. So they're taking 12 months to containerize everything, and then by end of 2017 they will have everything on Kubernetes.
So to Nishi's point though, the VMware ecosystem is very strong, right? It's been out there a long time. You also have the Azure ecosystem, which is growing quite a bit. I'm curious, Mike, from your perspective, how do you approach these almost these competing ecosystems out there, and providing that context to the end user who is just so used to using VMware, who is so used to using these traditional architectures?
I don't necessarily see them as competing. I see them more as complementary, right? VMware, OpenStack, even Azure.
But there is a competitive aspect to it because there's people. It's more of a mindset more than anything, because now you're trying to think, because maybe it's not competing from in a sense that these technologies are not complementary, but there's a mindset issue here.
But I think this mindset is kind of quickly shifting towards, I have to use containers. There is more and more education around people understanding what to use containers for and how to use them. And pretty much every platform, right? VMware, from what I know, Azure, OpenStack obviously provides a way to run Kubernetes on top of it, as well as AWS, right? And so it starts giving developers and users this ability to use containers and existing technology in parallel pretty efficiently, and start figuring out what they want to migrate, what makes sense not to migrate at this point. So it's not all or nothing kind of jump anymore.
Right.
And so also to return a little bit to Nishi's point, I think community did a great job recognizing the issue that it's hard to install Kubernetes and it's hard to upgrade Kubernetes. And I think between community and vendors, CoreOS included, in the last few releases, a lot of work has been done on keep improving and improving the adoption experience, right? And including kind of deploying Kubernetes on top of OpenStack so that you don't have to do all or nothing, making it easy to upgrade. So.
Right.
And I think there's a mistake by saying, it's Kubernetes versus, right?
Yeah.
So, those are they're very apples and oranges, right? So Kubernetes is becoming kind of the Swiss Army knife of application lifecycle management, if you will, right? And that application can be an infrastructure stack, as we've seen recently with some of the services for OpenStack, but they don't necessarily serve the same purpose, right? So we see, Kubernetes sitting on top of all of those other infrastructure service providing tools. So I think we should just stay away from, as much as possible, saying it's Kubernetes versus X, right? Because I don't think, especially versus the VMware and the Microsoft and the OpenStack, because they serve different purposes.
Right. And I guess the point that I'm thinking about is like just the frame of mind that people have, right? So they can get beyond that, right, to thinking more holistically. Joe?
In terms of community, open source, collaborating on Kubernetes, you're actually collaborating with your chief competitors, Red Hat, and I know there's another couple companies in this space as well. I mean, how does that work? Are you guys working together harmoniously, or is there a little bit of you want to keep certain technologies back? Or how does it work working with your competitor?
I mean, it actually works surprisingly well. Kind of, I can take an example of, for example, authentication effort, which Red Hat started in OpenShift, and it was not part of the upstream. And then Red Hat folks didn't have the bandwidth to necessarily contribute it all to the upstream. And it's actually CoreOS folks who picked up Red Hat code, committed it to the upstream, worked together with Red Hat to review all the commits. And it's an ongoing process. It's kind of a ball passing back and forth right now, for example, between CoreOS and Red Hat. Because it's a common recognition without strong authentication authorization story, Kubernetes is not ready for enterprise. And kind of the strong belief that the rising tide kind of rises all the ships, right? And I think in it kind of also, right, majority of the developers, they don't perceive developers from the other companies as competitors, more as collaborators. That's the fun of the enterprise of open source community, right?
I mean, but are there features that that Tectonic has that OpenShift doesn't, and vice versa? Or I mean, where are you competing strictly on support and implementation, or where's the competitive part of this come?
I think part of it is support. Part of it, I don't want to steal this thunder from Alex's Polvis keynote. So he'll walk a little bit over that. But I think OpenShift also, right, is a full platform as a service. And Red Hat, in my mind, OpenShift competes much more with Cloud Foundry, for example. Versus if you want straightforward Kubernetes distribution, you don't need necessarily PaaS in your environment, or you want to implement your own in-house PaaS, platform as a service, whatever you need, right? So Tectonic is just upstream Kubernetes, right? So I would compare Tectonic more to JKE only in your data center or on AWS versus compare it with a full-blown platform as a service.
How would you, moving on to like the direction of the overall Kubernetes community and how it's managed, right? So now there's more than 1,000, contributors. It's growing really by leaps and bounds. What is the thinking on how this community needs to be managed overall? What are some of, if you guys would prioritize things, what would they be?
I can start probably.
Yeah.
I mean, so the current model is there are a bunch of SIGs around various areas of Kubernetes, probably about 12 or 15 right now. And so each SIG is, it's early morning, so it kind of escapes me. It's an interest group, right? Special interest group around certain topics. So there are interest group around, for example, the same authentication, around networking, around Windows adoption. Yeah. So, and each group has 2 or 3 leaders, typically from different vendors, companies, which represent Kubernetes. And so it's very much kind of designed by committee in each SIG, and then merging it all upstream.
Is that working?
It's working there are discussions internally, right? But so far, as I observe, right, it's working fairly well, right? 1,000 developers shipping every 3 months. It's pretty impressive, right?
Yeah,
I mean, there's always things to improve, and some SIGs with time kind of outlive their usefulness.
Could you help address some of those things too as well?
Yeah, I can say, so we're most active in the networking SIG, and that works really well. We have a lot of, and kind of to the competitor competition kind of question as well. There's a lot of companies competing, but working together within that group, and it helps that there are 1 or 2 kind of elder statesmen, if you like, whose voices are respected, and they're very judicious in how they how they throw their opinions around. But it generally moves forward with everyone in tandem. I don't know if all the SIGs are as functional. If they're all as functional as the networking one, then I think we're doing well. I do think there's maybe a role that the and I don't know how the CNCF will play into this, but the kind of overall looking at the the overall release train and direction, and kind of that overall management has to happen there. And as more companies come in, and some of the earlier founders and architects of the project maybe have to give way to more of a larger community. I'm not sure how that's going to evolve.
Well, Nishi, what should it not be, if you were going to, think of it that way?
It should not become something where vendors have a huge influence. I think that would be contrary to everything that Kubernetes stands for. And it scares the hell out of me to think of a future like that. So I think it's great that there's an overall framework, and people who are technically very astute are able to direct any abstract and get it merged into the overall SIG. But yes, a huge influence from the vendors would spoil the whole momentum that we have on the Kubernetes environment. I would presume that would be.
And that's a hard balance to craft, right? Anytime you have an open source community that's generating as much value as this one is starting to, you're obviously going to have the flood of vendors coming in that see value in being in that space. And so the big thing is do you have the right leaders in the community itself that kind of be able to put the community first when they're doing that job, and then the people that are paying them kind of second as they go through that. I think that's anytime you look at any of the large open source projects that have become big, you're going to have that same type of issue happening.
What does it need to do? What do we need so that stability stays intact, so that developer ecosystem can grow? I mean, if you have a core that continues to kind of change and shift, you're going to run into problems with the supporting services on top of it, right? To be able to actually, so it can actually be, to continue to thrive.
I think the cluster that CNCF has built with help from Intel and other folks is a great platform for us to continue to have real, ongoing large-scale tests that ensure stability. I think that's something that's been missing from other projects and is going to be really valuable here. So I think the first thing is there has to be recognition that that's an issue, right? And we have that. And I think vendors like CoreOS, and not to blow smoke because this is their event, but I think they do a really good job in being seen as fairly neutral arbiters, despite being a vendor. They're very much driven by what's the needs of the community, and people look to them to kind of help make sure that those releases are stable.
Any last questions that
I think just to add on that also, one thing, right? I don't know if everyone recognizes Google and JKE, they run just upstream Kubernetes, right? And they have thousands, if not millions, of users at this point, and they are not making any modifications, right? And that's a living proof that Kubernetes can be used in very large-scale environments. And they have to be very careful about any new features, any upgrades, because they don't want to break production for many customers, obviously.
Any last question? Anyone have a question before we finish things up?
I do want to get, so if there's no last questions, I do want to give one kind of little plug a little bit to the Linux Foundation on this, right? So when Craig and myself and a few others kind of were thinking through how do we get the Kubernetes community to kind of get to that next level, right? We went through a process with some of the community there that we all know, and thought through this, right? What are we going to go do? How do we facilitate a community around this? And so, do we take the path of some of the other projects that have set up their own foundations and then have their own governing board, that sort of concept, which then, and through those conversations, tends to lead to the more vendor-driven version of things. Instead, we decided to go with the Linux Foundation. Dan, I think, is sitting over there, because they've got a long-standing track record of being that completely neutral party and driving, open source to the right ends. And so we think that, that was the right thing to go do. Now it's up to Dan and CNCF to facilitate that open community of developers as opposed to the community of vendors.
And that speaks, doesn't it, to the need to show the community that Kubernetes is going to be around. It has lasting power.
And that was the big driver for us to start thinking through that, was how do we build the confidence in the enterprise users base that Kubernetes is going to be there for the long haul. It's going to be innovative over time. It's going to be the way that they're going to want to deploy their applications and not get painted into any one corner.
So if I was going to say any core direction for community, that would be it then, wouldn't it, for the year ahead? It's like kind of the fuller participation of customers out there and making it really developer-centric and continue on that path.
And I think it's a brilliant idea to call it Cloud Native Computing Foundation, not the Kubernetes Foundation, because it means that people can contribute and new projects can come in as independent projects under the CNCF umbrella, so all part of the same family, but without that pressure on everything has to be part of Kubernetes. And that's one of the tensions that OpenStack had and the whole Big Tent process, and how do you manage, this is, those kind of, there are interdependencies there. These things are going to want to work together.
And if there are users and operators out there of Kubernetes in your environment, you're in operations, Dan is a good person to talk to, because the CNCF is looking for end users to help us with that feedback loop to make sure that the community itself is doing the right things. And so spend some time, he's trying to escape, but spend some time and talk to Dan to see if
that's Dan Kahn,
if your voice can be heard. Yes.
Dan Kahn of CNCF. Okay, well, thank you all very much. And we didn't get a chance to talk about the rest of the open source community. That's a conversation we can have for another time. But thank you very much for participating. I'd like to thank Intel for sponsoring. We give them a big hand again for making this possible. Appreciate that. And and everyone here, thank you for participating in the panel. Have a great show, everyone, and we'll talk to y'all soon. Thanks to Intel for sponsoring the Pancake Breakfast from Tectonic Summit. The topic for the discussion, how Kubernetes plays with the open source community. Intel is a major supporter of the cloud-native ecosystem and the new dimensions of a multi-cloud world. It has recently made significant investments in Snap, an open-source telemetry tool that is designed to easily collect, process, and publish telemetry data at scale. Learn more at snap-telemetry.io. That's snap-telemetry.io.